Good day, everyone. My name is Travis Bembenek, owner and CEO of Mexico News Daily. As always, here with my friend George Revis. Nice to see you, George.
Buenos dias, Travis. Happy to be here.
All right, so today we're kicking off season 3, and some of the topics we have teed up for season 3 I think are going to be very, very good, right? We're going to mix it up a little bit into some pretty controversial topics, and just from conversations I've been having with you in the last few weeks, it's evident that you are very wrong about many of these issues, and so I look forward, into our conversations and helping clear things up.
Well, today we're gonna talk about fracking, right? Because it's been big in the news in Mexico. You wrote an article about it in Mexico News Daily last week and sort of broke it down. Sounds, from your article like you're pretty pro fracking for Mexico. And I guess, Sheinbaum this week is going to be commenting on what sort of the fracking commission, what they've come up with over the last 60 days, and then I guess they're going to decide soon if they're going to move forward with fracking or not. But before we get into that, Travis, if you could just sort of give us a brief history sort of on energy in Mexico leading up to fracking, because I think that's sort of important, right?
Sure, and I guess I'd ask our listeners to just stick with us through this, because you may think, why do I care about energy in Mexico? But what you're going to see through this conversation is that the decisions made or not made by President Sheinbaum and her administration over the next week or so really are going to provide a key indication, I think, on where she's going to take the economy going forward. It's really important. So let me explain why. So Mexico, energy policy in Mexico is right up there with like talking about religion, abortion, and politics, right? It's frustrating to talk about. It's annoying to talk about. You shouldn't talk about it at a party because it's too emotional. And the reason for that is, Mexico 100 years ago had foreign companies, primarily companies from the United States, coming in and extracting a lot of oil, right? And at the time it was deemed as not necessarily benefiting the Mexican people. And so in 1938, Mexico nationalized the energy industry. So we won't get into the wonkiness of it, but at the end of the day, what it said was foreign companies can't do this anymore. The Mexican government, under the company Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, will take the lead on all energy extraction, production, and distribution in the country. And it also ensured that ownership of what's below ground in Mexico is not of the landowner. It's the property of the government, right? So very different. In the United States, if you live in rural Texas and they find oil on your land, it's yours. In Mexico, it's not, right? It's the government's. So going back to 1938, almost 90 years, the government has taken the lead and all the decisions in terms of energy production in Mexico.
And that's interesting, and we should briefly sort of talk about, I guess, what's going on with Pemex right now, right? Because, that's relevant to the fracking. I guess Pemex, this is just my general knowledge of it. I mean, it sort of ran successfully, that nationalization of it ran successfully for a long time, right?
That's right.
But recently, over the past, 5-10 years, maybe, Pemex has been hemorrhaging money. Instead of adding money to the economy, the government has been having to bail out Pemex and support Pemex, and there's been, just all sorts of controversy surrounding Pemex, accusations of, widespread corruption and blah, 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 right? So Pemex
just to add a little color to that, George, the model that was set up sounded good back in the day, right? Pemex would make a lot of money and essentially provide royalties back to the Mexican government and the Mexican people, right, for things like healthcare and schooling and all that. And that worked for decades. And it's really been the last, I can't pinpoint how many years exactly, but like you said, 5, 10, maybe as many as 20 years. Production's been declining, even though Mexico has significant reserves. Like you said, massive accusations of corruption. It's the most indebted oil company in the world. There was recently a spill in the Gulf that they denied, and then ultimately, after all the evidence made it brutally obvious that it was them, they admitted that it was them. So just a poorly run company, and now, as you said, instead of providing a dividend to the Mexican people, the Mexican people have to, pay Pemex to keep it going and keep all its pensions and everything going every year. So it's really a disaster at this point.
Well, and we'll touch on this in a little bit, but that's also why some of this fracking stuff is so controversial, because it's kind of like, well, who's going to run it?
That's right.
If they do approve it, is Pemex going to be involved? But let's talk about that in a little bit. So
one other historical thing, George, I think that's important. So, Mexico has been aware of Pemex's problems for a while, right? So the question is, what are they doing? How are they trying to solve it? And the two previous presidents tried. So I'll give you just two quick examples. Enrique Peña Nieto, who was the president before AMLO, who was the president before Sheinbaum, he actually privatized the distribution part of oil and gas in Mexico. So if you think about it, going back 15, 20 years ago, every single gas station was a Pemex gas station. What Enrique Peña Nieto did for the first time was allow private companies, foreign companies, to invest and build their own gas stations. So what that did was, it didn't help Pemex's financial problems, but it didn't make them worse, because obviously building, hundreds and thousands of gas stations across the country is expensive. And that burden was no longer on Pemex because they were, privatizing that part of it. So that was one sort of change made in energy policy. And then another thing that took place during AMLO, curiously, Mexico does not refine all of the oil that it extracts, right? So, I'm not an energy expert, but you've got sort of extraction, and then refining of it, and then it's turned into gasoline and sold as gasoline. Distribution, right? So we just talked about distribution, but the refining part, ironically, Mexico extracts its oil and has to send the majority of it abroad. Most of it is sent to Texas to be refined and then sold back to Mexico as gasoline for Mexicans.
That was why AMLO's sort of pet infrastructure project was the huge refinery that they're building now.
That's right. So the Dos Bocas refinery, so AMLO's solution to that was, we need to build more domestic refining capacity. Sounds great, makes sense, and they actually did. Now, the project ran massively over budget. It took 2 years longer, but it is up and it is running, and Mexico now is able to refine far more of a percentage of its extracted oil. So it does have more energy independence in gasoline because it has increased refining capabilities.
So thank you for that. Let's sort of get back to the, just the fracking issue. And I guess what they're doing now is for the last 60 days, Sheinbaum's started a commission to sort of look at the Tampico-Misantla, is that how you pronounce it? Misantla?
Right.
Site, to basically just, study and analyze whether it would work, or to report those findings back to her so that then they could decide if they're going to move forward. So give us sort of a breakdown of the Tampico-Misantla site.
Sure. So what's interesting is Sheinbaum, following in the footsteps of AMLO, has positioned this fracking study as a matter of sovereignty and energy independence, right? So the same way AMLO justified spending billions and billions on refining in Mexico to allow for more domestic production and less reliance on the United States, that's the tone that Sheinbaum has been talking about with fracking. So remember, fracking produces oil and natural gas. What she's concerned about primarily is, as fracking has taken off in the United States, Mexico has begun buying a huge amount of natural gas from Texas. So a lot of the manufacturing plants in Mexico are now run on natural gas from Texas.
Yeah, they import 75% of their natural gas from the States.
That's right.
Meanwhile, they're sitting on, that site, the Tampico-Misantla site, which is basically as large as the site is wherever in Texas that they're importing that gas from, right?
Right. So, but just to put a clarifying point on that. So Mexico has converted and is building many new power plants that are running on natural gas. It's cleaner, it's cheaper, it's cheaper as a fuel, but it's also cheaper to build natural gas plants. So Mexico primarily has been, building out its grid with natural gas coming from the United States. Now, getting back to Sheinbaum, she said, we need to reduce our dependence on the United States for natural gas, right? Similar to what we did with refining. And so she commissioned a study in mid-April and gave them 60 days basically to evaluate if fracking could be done sustainably in Mexico. And what she means by sustainably is there's a lot of concerns around fracking with chemical leakage, right? So the chemicals that are used getting into the water table. And the second thing being just sort of water reuse and recycling, right? There's a lot of concern with the amount of water used in fracking. So she asked the commission to go look at those topics and get back to her. And I think next week in her mañanera, she's going to talk about it. And they're going to come back and present the report. Can fracking be done sustainably in Mexico? Now, I think the evidence of 20 years of fracking in the United States is going to be absolutely, right? There were issues at the beginning. They now have figured it out, and they're doing it on a massive scale in the United States, and those learnings can be applied to Mexico.
So, if they do approve it, and I mentioned this before, but if they do approve it, then it's sort of, how is it going to work, right?
Yep.
Is then it going to be managed by the now dysfunctional Pemex, and are they the ones who are going to be awarding contracts for the companies that come in and actually do the drilling? How are those contracts basically going to be structured? But mainly, is Pemex going to be in charge of this new fracking initiative, right?
Right. So that first hurdle that everybody's anxious to hear is, will the Sustainability Commission come back giving fracking the green light, right? All indications would suggest that they will. Again, I don't have a seat or insight into that commission, but if you just look at the amount of fracking being done elsewhere in the world, it seems like that they get a green light.
This is just a random question. Was the study done specifically for this site? Or was it done
I think it was done
overall just to look at the sustainability of it regardless of the site?
What the commission was asked to do was look at the practices that are in place and that exist today, and thinking of Mexico, could they be applied to Mexico? So, George, you've mentioned this site. I think it's worth just spending a minute on it. Knowing that this commission was going to be providing their results soon, I recently interviewed an expert in this field. So he's a geologist by training, and he's the COO of the Mexican Petroleum Company. His name is Pablo Eisner. I wanted to understand, how big is the opportunity in Mexico? How impactful could this be? because I feel like that gets lost. Sheinbaum isn't talking about that. She's talking about sovereignty and independence.
And
from
she
the
should be
US.
talking about that.
Exactly. So if you look at the numbers of the Permian Basin, which is the big famous basin in western Texas, so far, it has provided $1 trillion of economic impact, 1 trillion, and 800,000 jobs. Okay, and Mexico has two significant bases, one more in the north, kind of sharing the Eagle Ford Basin with Texas and northern Mexico. But we can even forget that one for this purposes of this discussion. In the Gulf area of Mexico, there's another basin, you mentioned the name of it.
Yeah, the Tampico-Misantla.
And that one, all estimates are that the amount of hydrocarbons in that basin are almost the same as the Permian Basin. Said differently, if fracking takes place in that basin, there's no reason to think it couldn't provide $1 trillion of economic impact and 800,000 jobs, like it has done in the Permian Basin. Now, I want to point out a couple other statistics here that are important. The Permian Basin today is producing 6 million barrels a day of oil. The Tampico one in Mexico is doing 60,000. So it's 1/100th of the production, even though it's a similar size basin. It's producing 1/100th as much of the natural gas. And in the Permian, there's thousands of wells being drilled, horizontal wells, each year. In the Tampico one in Mexico, there's been a total of 62 wells drilled. So, they've dabbled a little bit here and there, but for the most part, they've leveraged it 1/100th as much as the Permian in Texas.
Yeah, and if they were to, go full bore, the estimates are that just the Tampico Misantla site could be producing almost the same, right?
That's right.
Of whatever, 6 million barrels or close to it.
Yeah, I mean, actually, in my conversation with Pablo, from the Mexican Petroleum Company, being a geologist, he got very wonky into the way that the geology is in that Tampico site. And long story short, it's much more hydrocarbon dense. So it's actually, for lack of a oversimplification here, it's easier and quicker to get the oil and natural gas out of that because of the geography, even than in the Permian Basin. So, huge opportunity, and I think, perhaps that's Sheinbaum's strategy to focus on the sustainability part first, but I'm sure and hopefully she recognizes that Mexico has a real growth problem, a GDP growth problem, and this can contribute, relatively quickly and massively to it. And Mexico has an employment problem, right? The unemployment rate isn't bad, but Mexico has, more than half of its employees are in the informal economy, right? So they're not getting benefits, they're not getting vacation time or sick pay or anything like that. And so these would be high quality, high paid, formal jobs that the economy
And
really needs.
the number of jobs that it could potentially create is staggering, right? I mean, it's something
Right.
like 800,000 people.
Right, I mean,
or
so
was that-
Pablo said the Permian is 800,000. He said it would be actually, far higher in Mexico because the cost of labor is significantly less. And then if you start thinking of the impact on families, right? Each employee has a family, and it's massive. It's really the most massive opportunity for growth and employment. I think
At a time when growth has been stagnant, the Mexican economy is sort of not doing well. It's also sort of, we've talked about this. It's kind of hard to figure out why the Mexican economy is not doing well right now. Whatever. The GDP growth is off, and yeah, I mean, now this is a potential massive opportunity to turn that around with, not the flick of a switch. Obviously, it's a major undertaking, but it could have a dramatic impact on that, right?
That's right. Now, George, you mentioned briefly the type of contract. That's going to be important, right? And I think, so the first thing to look for is, does Sheinbaum give the green light based on the sustainability report? The second thing is how it's structured, right? Because if companies are forced to work with Pemex or go through Pemex, this will either not move or it'll move much, much, much slower, right? Pemex does work with suppliers, obviously, and Pemex is famous for not paying them, or taking months or years to pay them, and so the way it's structured is going to be really important, and hopefully she allows the fracking companies to come in and do their thing, and allow Mexico to get a royalty and taxes on it, instead of trying to run it through Pemex.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I'm trying to find in your article where you said, I guess you said how they do it in the States, right, is what the landowner gets like 20% of.
Yeah, I mean, an oversimplification in the U.S. is the landowner gets a 20% royalty. There's about 30% in taxes that go to the government, and then the company that's doing all the work really gets the other 50%, right? And the thinking is that if it's a similar structure in Mexico, where here it's not the landowner getting 20%, but the government could get a 20% royalty, there's about 30% in taxes, and then if you allow the fracking company to get their 50%, the numbers make sense for the fracking company.
When I read that in the article, in your article, I didn't really understand that. I mean, the government is getting, you say 20% royalties and then 30% in taxes. That means 50% is all going to the government. I mean, what's the difference really if it's a royalty or taxes?
Well, I mean, the point is, it's about 50% of what's extracted needs to go to the fracking company for it to make business sense for them. Right. So whether it's, royalty, taxes, whatever, the model that has worked, incredibly successfully in the United States has been about 50-50, right? Again, in the US, it's 20% the landowner, 30% taxes. The landowner doesn't get anything in Mexico. So if it's about 50%, 50%, that will make sense to companies. Now, if it's routed through Pemex and Pemex is willing to offer a 20%, commission or whatever the right word is to the energy company, they're not going to do it, right? And then it won't make sense. So it will be important to get that part of it right for this opportunity to be fully realized as well.
So what do you say? I've read some of the comments, in the article that you wrote, but what do you say to the people who are saying we should be investing in renewable energy, not in more oil and gas? We should be investing in solar or wind or whatever. That tends to be where, a lot of the countries are leaning. So how do you?
I think it's a good point, right? I mean, many people sort of bombarded me and us by saying, why are we even having this conversation? We should be looking forward to a zero hydrocarbon world. Mexico has a ton of sunlight. Mexico should be going all in on solar. That was sort of the theme of like a little bit finding it insulting that I was even talking about fracking. And I think the answer is Mexico should be doing much more solar. Mexico does have a lot of solar on like individual home level. Sheinbaum's administration is investing and incentivizing massive investment in solar. That's a good thing. It's a great thing. It needs to continue and be accelerated. But that is not going to create the economic growth, and that is not going to create the employment growth that is needed. Solar's wonderful. It will provide Mexicans with clean energy, but you're not selling it, right? If Mexico is actually extracting natural gas and oil through fracking, they can sell it, right? They can make money from other countries on that. And so I think that's an important distinction. And the other thing is, and I apologize, I'm coughing so much, you know, it's not an either or, right? Unfortunately, we'd all like to have zero hydrocarbons going forward, but we're all seeing that's going to take decades yet, especially given the energy demand from AI and electric cars and things like that. We're going to need, you know, hydrocarbons for a long time yet.
Okay, what else? You sound pretty pro fracking, or just, you know, pro Mexico doing it to, you know, obviously produce that much more energy, but also to sort of be a bailout on the current economy. But just in summary, what are your feelings on it?
Well, I think, you know, if it were 15, 20 years ago, I'd be concerned, right? The same way a lot of people were concerned in the United States. You know, is the water table going to be affected? Are people's, you know, taps going to start tasting like or smelling like, you know, natural gas? Those were things we saw in the news 15, 20 years ago in the U.S. But the industry's come a tremendously long way. We've seen, and a lot of people don't, I think it just happens quietly, right? But the U.S. has been able to go to being a net exporter of energy. It's, you know, it's provided energy independence. It's provided price stability for Americans. And I think, you know, why shouldn't Mexico get in on that as well, right? Mexico has been blessed as well with these hydrocarbons. There's now 20 years of experience in doing this and doing it right, and doing it safe. And that Tampico Basin in particular is one of the rainiest, you know, least water scarce parts of Mexico. So I don't think water is an issue. Now in the northern part, in the desert, you know, that's a different issue. There is a lot of recycling that takes place. But that being said, I really do believe it's kind of a no-brainer for Mexico to go all in on this.
It's also not in a very faultuous area, like earthquake prone. You know, that's on the Pacific coast, you know, which is one of the other big concerns about it. So,
that's exactly
you know, it's kind of away from,
you know, and not super population dense areas either, you know. So I think, you know, again, I'm not from this industry, and if anything, I lean more environmentalist in my heart. But as I've analyzed this and read about it, I think, you know, Mexico would actually be foolish not to take advantage of this opportunity.
well, it'll certainly be interesting to see what happens. You know, you know, I can't wait to, if they do announce it this week, I can't wait to see, you know, A, what they come back with, B, if they do move forward, you know, I can't wait to see, you know, how they divert away from Pemex managing it, or if Pemex does manage it, and just how this all shakes out. So, as
It'll be
always,
interesting to follow.
We'll stay tuned for the news on this moving forward with Mexico News Daily.
Thanks, George. Good discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. That was good, and whatever. We'll see you next time.
Talk soon.